So I find that very interesting. So I'm going to talk today, I'm going to be presenting probably some new ideas for you. Even though you have talked about character education. And the topic of this session is why character matters. Why does it matter? But before we get to that, I'm going to talk about some other things. I'm going to give a background to what's going on in Indian society, the kind of changes that are happening in Indian society today. So I may introduce some new ideas, use some new words, and you have to adjust to my pronunciation. So I'm an American, so I speak English with an American pronunciation. So you'll have to adjust your ears, adjust your rhythm to my rhythm. So we're going to talk about. We have 4 parts of this session today. Why character matters. To start with, I'm going to introduce you to the concept of progress and the modern age. You know that word progress or progress? Okay, that will be our first discussion. Then we'll talk about the changes that are occurring in India. I'm older than all of you, but I've also been involved in India since before any of you were born. So I first visited India in 1989. Nobody here was born at that time. So I lived in India from 1998 until 2002. So probably 1998 was about when some of you might have been born. So my oldest daughter, she was born in December of 1997. So maybe she's close to some of your age. Some of you? Yeah, within 1 year. What year were you born? Okay, 99, 2000. Okay. My second daughter was born in 2001. She was born in Secunderabad. So I have an Indian daughter. And I also have a son. He's 12. He just completed 12 years. So I have been coming to India for many years and studying, observing the things that are going on in India. I traveled to 20 states, so I've been all over, seen things change from 1989 until today. And change is happening at a faster and faster pace. You're seeing it. You come from many districts. Now you're coming to Hyderabad, and things are changing very rapidly in places like Hyderabad, whereas in the districts, it's not changing as quickly. But change is still coming. We'll talk about that. Then we're going to have a session. I'm going to pose you with some questions. I want to have you consider some issues. Maybe you've considered before, maybe you haven't. But based on some of the things we talked about in the first 2 parts of the session, we're going to have a discussion. I like to have more interactive learning. In India, the common teaching method is what we call a pedagogical method. Pedagogy, you've heard that term? Okay, pedagogy comes from a Greek peda, like a pediatrician. Some of you might want to be a pediatrician. A pediatrician is what? A children's doctor. Okay? Because the word pedia means child. Well, pedagogy means learning for children. That's kind of the general word. There's another term that's not as popular. It's called andragogy. There's pedagogy, andragogy. That's also based on Greek. That's learning for adults. Adults learn differently than children. Pedagogy is more lecture, just giving you information. This is what you need to know. You're going to have a test, you've got to know this. So write it all down. Study it, get it in there, lock it in your brain. Don't forget. Don't let it spill out of your brain. But adult learning is based on this model. In the Western tradition, we call this Socratic learning. Have you heard that term? Socratic learning. Have you?
Socrates.
Have you heard of Socrates?
Yes.
Okay, Socrates was a famous philosopher.
Yes.
So what we know about Socrates, we learned from his student Plato, because Socrates didn't write any books. He just asked questions, and he engaged his students. He made them think, why is it this way? What do you think about this? He would draw it out from them. So that requires you to have some knowledge, some experience. So philosophy is a higher level learning. You know that term, philosophy?
Yes.
Have you studied philosophy?
No.
For the Greeks, philosophy was not for young children. Philosophy was for people who had experience. The word philosophy is a combination of two words, philo and sophia. Philo means love. Sophia, do you know what that word means? Wisdom. So philo, sophia, the love of wisdom. Philosophy is for people who love wisdom. That's part of your slogan here, right? You have wisdom, virtue, and service. I like that. That's a nice slogan. Not many schools have that mixture. Wisdom is different than just knowledge. Knowledge is just information. But wisdom involves understanding, going deeper. Not just knowing what, but knowing why, knowing how. Higher level learning. As you get older, as you get into higher level thinking, you need to do more thinking than just repeating. Pedagogy, you come up to a board, what is this? I give you a word, you repeat. Right? Philosophy. Philosophy. Just repeating. Okay? That's pedagogy. But if I say, what does philosophy mean? What is philosophy to you? How do we do philosophy? What questions do we ask in philosophy? Is there a correct answer? I want you to think. So you have to engage your mind and draw on all of your experiences and put that together and begin to think. What's the meaning of these things? How do I make sense of these things? That's getting into philosophy. See, the Greeks, when Plato, you've heard of Plato? Sometimes you say Plato. In American English, we call him Plato. Plato was a philosopher. Some people might call him a scientist, but we wouldn't. More normally, we call him a philosopher. He was also the teacher of another great student, another great teacher. Do you know who that was? Aristotle. You've all heard of Aristotle. Very famous philosopher. He was the student of Plato. So Plato was the student of Socrates. Aristotle was the student of Plato. And Aristotle, he was one of the great thinkers of all time. He was also a great teacher. He had a great student. I'm sure you've heard of him, but do you know who Aristotle's most famous student was? He was not a philosopher. Huh? Any idea? The philosophy, these teachers, they wanted to raise up, like this school, you wanted to raise up leaders. So the schools of philosophy, Plato's school was called the Academy. That's where we get the word academic. It goes back to the school name for Plato's school. That was called the Academy. Aristotle and Plato were trying to raise up this kind of leader they called the philosopher king. A ruler who would think, who would not just be a fighter, not just be a warrior, but be someone who thinks deeply, thinks about the meaning of life. And his great pupil was a king and became one of the greatest conquerors in history. Does that give you a clue? Huh?
మీకు అర్థమవుతుందా లేదా ట్రాన్స్లేట్ చేయాలా?
So this king actually expanded the Greek Empire. He was actually from a place called Macedonia. And first, he conquered all of Greece, unified
Translation
Greece. And then he took the Greek army and he went to Persia and he conquered the mighty Persian army. They were far outnumbered, but he conquered the Persian army and then he came all the way to India and conquered India. Now you know. So that's the tradition, that's the multi-generational heritage of philosophy. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Alexander. So through Alexander, then Greek philosophy, Greek learning spread throughout much of the world and influenced many societies. And so much of Western learning is based on the things that were developed in the Greek civilization. So philosophy is getting you to think, drawing you out, making you, and that's what I'm going to try to do today. I'm going to try to get you to think. I'm going to present some information, but then I'm going to make you think. How does this relate to character? Character matters, but we want to think about where things are going. Where is society going? So, how many of you have heard the word modern? Everybody knows that word? Yes. What does it mean? Okay. For many people it just means new, but actually that's not what it means. It actually has, modernity is a cultural phenomenon. It hasn't been around forever, but it's been around for about 400 years, less than 400 years. And this phenomenon of modernity started in Europe, and slowly it has spread and has affected pretty much the entire globe. India today is very much influenced by modernity. But you just think it means new. But there's more to it than that. There's intellect, sometimes you just study ideas, but you don't know the history of ideas. Where do these ideas come from? So that's why I like introducing you and getting you to think about people like Plato and Socrates and Aristotle. Well, the history of ideas, the ideas of modernity have not been around forever. The ideas of modernity really have their origins in the 17th century. In fact, if we're to draw a line in the sand to say, okay, where does modernity start? From what point can we say it starts? And it's basically in the 1630s with another philosopher named Rene Descartes. You've heard that name? He's a famous thinker, very influential on global thought. Whether or not you know about what he did, what he thought, what he taught, what he wrote, you have been influenced. Because he wrote a paper on the discourse of the scientific method. He made the scientific method popular. He was a radical skeptic. He questioned everything. How can you know that? So you study your books and you just accept it. Okay, this is a fact. At the time of Descartes, everybody revered Aristotle. Aristotle was the smartest man they knew. So if Aristotle said something, wrote something, it was true. It could not be refuted. But did Aristotle know everything? No, he didn't. For example, he thought that the earth was the center of the universe. It made sense. There's a myth out there that people thought the world was flat. That's not true. The great thinkers of the Middle Ages did not believe the world was flat. They knew the world was round. They studied the stars, they studied astronomy, they studied geometry, they knew the math calculations. They believed the world was round. But they believed the earth was the center of the universe. They believed that because they could observe, they would watch the stars move. And over the course of the night, the stars would move from this end to this end, as if the earth was fixed and they were moving. It makes sense. We still use that in our language. In the morning, we say the sun rises. Is the sun rising? The sun is staying still. What's moving? The earth. Now we think that. But then we believe the sun was moving around the earth because it appears that way. It makes sense. From our observation, okay, the sun is moving, the moon moves. The stars, everything moves around the earth. Aristotle taught that, he believed it, everybody accepted it. But then they started developing some new technologies, and they developed a technology called a telescope. Yeah? So you have this guy named Galileo. You know Galileo? So he started observing the stars, and he saw motion that couldn't happen before. And it didn't make sense. The theory of the earth being the center did not make sense with the things that he was observing. And somebody earlier, named Copernicus, had written a theory that maybe the sun was the center of the universe, not the earth. But he didn't know it. He couldn't prove it. Copernicus wrote this theory, but he couldn't prove it. But Galileo finally had the technology to support the theory of Copernicus. Well, René Descartes he was a contemporary with Galileo. They lived at the same time. It was at a time when many things were being questioned. Authority, science, politics, many things. So he questioned everything. How can I know anything? His famous saying is, he finally concluded, okay, I can know one thing. I can know that I exist. How can I know I exist? Because I think. I have the ability to think. I have consciousness. Therefore, I must exist. So, the saying in Latin was cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. I think, therefore I exist. But he was also a mathematician. And he was a brilliant mathematician, and he built on the writings of Francis Bacon, and he developed this scientific method, and he proposed that scientific knowledge, if we pursue scientific knowledge, we could do better than the ancients. Up until that time, if you wanted to be a person of learning, you studied the classics. You studied Plato, you studied Aristotle, you studied Homer, you studied Galen, the people, Hippocrates, these people who had written about medicine 2,000 years before. They had the best knowledge, so if you wanted to study those things, you just studied those ancient. That's the pre-modern way. For Europe, it's also the pre-modern way in Asia. In India, that would be like the Vedas. Okay, where you want to just perpetuate the same patterns. So the pre-modern way of thinking is that to achieve the good life, we just need to look at the golden age. Look back to that classical age when our ancestors shaped our society, when they formed the language, formed our customs, and the great architecture and literature of our society. So if we want greatness, we just need to go back, study the ancients, study the classics. That's the pre-modern way of thinking. But modernity, beginning with René Descartes, says, no, we can have a better future. We can have a better future. How can we have a better future? This better future is this concept of progress. Progress will lead to a better future. How will we achieve progress? Well, René Descartes was not alone in shaping that, but he was he started the conversation. If you study intellectual history, the discourse changed in the 17th century, starting with René Descartes. He caused many people to think completely differently. One of the most influential people that was influenced by René Descartes was a man named Isaac Newton. He's the founder of calculus, infinitesimal calculus, founder of classical physics, what we call Newtonian physics. Okay? He based his ideas, he built on what Descartes wrote, made him think, and he developed his ideas after that. He wouldn't have developed his ideas had he not read Descartes. Many things changed after that. He said we can do better, we can have a better future. And basically there were three things that if you want to pursue a better future, pursue progress, it's comprised of three things. Scientific learning, not just reading the old literature. Test the theory. Galileo proved it. You can't just depend on Aristotle. Aristotle had this theory that two objects, that one object that was heavier would fall faster to the ground. And he had a very complicated theory to explain why that would be. And he's a very smart man, very convincing. So everybody accepted it. But then Galileo went to a tower and did experiments. He used the scientific method. He experimented. And he said he took a light object and a heavy object, and guess what? Same speed. Aristotle's theory was wrong. It was the evidence did not support it. So it made Descartes think we need scientific learning. We want better knowledge, we have to have scientific learning. So he proposed the scientific method as a means of that. So scientific learning as opposed to traditional literature, traditional authorities. Secondly, education. Well, if you develop scientific learning, you have to disseminate that knowledge. Up until that time, education was something for the elite, for the ruling class. Common people were farmers. They didn't go to school, they didn't study, they couldn't read. They didn't do math. They said, okay, if you want a better future, you need scientific learning and you need education. And thirdly, especially developed by a man named John Locke. Have you heard of John Locke? One of the most influential political philosophers of history. He's an Englishman, John Locke. The founders of the United States, when they wrote the founding documents of the United States, our Declaration of Independence, they basically they plagiarized John Locke. It was his political philosophy that shaped, he was an Englishman, but it was his thoughts that shaped the formation of the United States. But he promoted this idea of a social contract. At that time, almost all the nations of the earth were ruled by monarchs, kings, queens, sultans, different kinds of hereditary rulers. And they believed that they had a right from God, usually born at birth, sometimes born in battle, but a right from God to rule over all their people. So they had that God-given right to rule over the people, and it was all their people's duty to obey them. John Locke proposed a different idea, saying, no, there's a social contract, that we have a right to revolution. If we don't like, if the king is not doing justice, if the king is not representing the needs and concerns of the common people, then the common people can rise up against them. That had just happened. It happened in the 1640s in England. They had a civil war. So that shaped the political philosophy of modernity. So it shifted from the rights of a king to the individual rights of the common people. So modernity can seek a better future through scientific learning, education, and individual rights and freedom. That's this package of modernity. The ideas were shaped in the 17th century, but it took hundreds of years for those ideas to bear fruit in changing society, to develop new kinds of learning, new ways of doing medicine, new ways of understanding industry. The steam engine, all those things came out of the pursuit of scientific learning. The Industrial Revolution, the age of exploration, all of these things were part of modernity. India was introduced to many of the ideas of modernity during British rule. The British ruled in India for 190 years. From 1757 to 1947. 190 years they ruled. For 100 years they ruled under a company, the British East India Company. For 90 years, the Crown, the British monarchy, ruled India. So through that, they came, because the British were the primary people that developed modernity. They're one of the key societies that developed the ideas and the technologies that we understand as modernity, that pursuit of progress. So India had the telegraph soon after it was invented. They had railroads and telephones, and many things. But when independence came, the Indian government was suspicious of all things from outside of India. They didn't want to be part of the globalized world. So for 44 years, India tried to be self-supporting. The Swaraj, Swadesh, all these Swami words, right? Self-rule, self-reliance. didn't want to have international trade. And so there was not much progress, not much change. Things just, the same vehicles being manufactured from 1959 to 1991, the same vehicles. Ambassador, maybe some of you know what that vehicle is. For many years, that's all we would see on the roads, was Ambassadors and maybe Pod Minis. Only a few models, same model, year after year after year. Now, how many different models are there? So many different vehicles. Every year, new models come out. In 1997, 1998, when my family moved to India, telephone calls were very expensive. We lived in a village. In that village, women would process cashews. They have these wooden sticks, and they would club the burnt cashews and peel them. They'd work all day and make 30 rupees. 30 rupees. To make a trunk call, at that time, if you wanted to make a phone call, you had to go to an STD booth. A trunk call from the village to Delhi costs 40 rupees for 1 minute. A common laborer was making 30 rupees all day, but a 1-minute phone call costs 40 rupees. It was very funny. You'd go wait in line for the phone. People they'd have their finger, because it was by the second. The meter would go, and they'd see the rupees going. They would not say hello. They would not say anything. How are you? How are your children? Nothing nice. Very quickly. Very quick. Get the message. Get it done. You don't want to pay any more. Today, India has some of the cheapest phone costs in all the world. Very cheap. Yeah, the internet is cheap. So many different kinds of mobile phones. Cheap, cheap, cheap. Cheap and best. Yeah. Complete change in just 20 years. 20 years. From most expensive calls to the most cheap calls. And it's prosperity is coming. So what does that result in? So the middle class especially, everybody that wants to do better, they just accept progress. They don't understand progress, they don't understand modernity, they just want prosperity. They just want what modernity has to offer. Okay, India pushed modernity